Okay, wow, that was a great introduction, and just a little bit about Kirk. As Kirk said, we've known each other for a little over 20 years, and when I started in the JD PhD program back then when it was MCP Hahnemann University in Villanova, I was a first-year graduate student, and Kirk was a first-year faculty member at MCP Hahnemann. He'd come up from Virginia. So we were very excited that Kirk Heilbron was joining us. We all knew that Kirk was coming. Of course, he already had an established reputation. In fact, in 1995-96, Kirk was president of APLS and the American Board of Forensic Psychology at the same time, okay? Which further confirms my suspicion that he has used performance-enhancing drugs throughout his career. But I just wanted to be around Kirk. I wanted to just, anything. I wanted to be around him. I wanted to just osmotically learn from him. I remember, and this is not a joke, I remember pacing back and forth outside of his office as a first year, trying to come up with something to say, to start a conversation with him, because I just wanted to create a dialogue. So it's been great for 20 years. We've worked together, and the transition going from being a student to a colleague and building a friendship along the way has been really valuable. It's no secret to anyone who knows me that I've tried to model my career after Kirk. And it's been a real privilege for me to learn from him. So Kirk, thank you very much. I appreciate it. But I do want to tell you a story that involves Kirk that will illustrate both a good moment for me and a bad moment for me. This was about 10 years ago. I just joined the faculty at Drexel, and I was at APLS, and a student came up to me, and she started talking to me about Drexel and my research, and she was very nice, very polite, and she wanted to know more about what we do at Drexel, and she was asking me a lot of questions about my research that I was having trouble answering, and then I realized it's because it wasn't my research that she was asking about. And after about 3 or 4 minutes, I realized that she mistook me for Kirk. So this was a great moment for me. This was great. So, but I had to let her know. And I said to her, look, I'm not Kirk Heilbron. And she's like, oh, you're not? And I said, no, I'm not. So, but I felt good. But then I said to her, I said, I'm Dave DeMatteo. And I'll never forget her reaction. She went, huh? Like that. So, okay. So, this is, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for joining us. You know, when you find yourself in this position as president of the organization, you give a lot of thought to what you're going to talk about. And when I sat in the audience for these things as a student and early career professional, I didn't envision myself being president of the organization. So that's kind of a way for me to say to you that I view this as a privilege and I do not take it for granted, okay? So here's what we're going to talk about today. APLS has been around for nearly 50 years, so I think this is a good time for us to take stock of where we are. So I'm going to do a little bit tracing the development and status of APLS organization, a little bit of a history lesson of how we came about. And then I'm going to talk about some challenges that are facing APLS's organization and the field. In particular, science. It's not hyperbole right now to say that science is in a bit of a crisis. We have the failure to replicate, we have peer review fraud, we have falsification of data, we have p-hacking. This is not limited to psychology, but it certainly has touched our profession. I'll talk about that a bit. We also have some unprecedented change within our parent organization of APA. We have the independent report, right, the Hoffman report. We have loss of public confidence in what we do. We have a high-profile lawsuit against APA. And we have an unprecedented loss of members from APA. And some of these issues intertwine with what's happening politically in the United States. We are in the midst of remarkable change in the United States. Some of the administration's new policies, including slashing research funding, can certainly affect our enterprise. So these are actually not the challenges that I'm going to discuss, but these are the challenges that are facing us. And along the way, of course, this is not going to be too negative. I want to talk about some ways that we can move forward productively. Okay, so let's see where we are as an organization. For some of you younger APLS members, it might be useful to hear how APLS came to be. And to do that, I have to put it in some context. think it'll be useful for you to know what was happening in the broader society, what was happening in courts, for you to understand why an organization like APLS was needed. So I'm not going to go back far. We know that the intersection of law and mental health dates back over 2,000 years. You could look back at ancient Greek and Roman and Hebrew texts and find precursors to insanity defense, but we're not going to go back that far. 1908, this is generally regarded by some people as a foundational text in law and psychology and forensic psychology. If we fast forward a little bit, early 1900s, we see psychologists are beginning to work with adult and juvenile offenders. They're beginning to do fitness evaluations for personal law enforcement and pretrial assessments. After World War II, clinical psychology really became established as a profession. And then in the watershed case of United States versus Jenkins from the United States, from the DC Circuit in 1962, this is when a federal appellate court held that properly trained and qualified psychologists could serve as expert witnesses. They could opine on mental health disorders. Previously, that was limited to medical doctors. This is the backdrop for how APLS came to be developed. And of course, when you're talking about the history of APLS, you have to acknowledge Tom Grisso, who is sitting here in the audience, which I appreciate. And Tom wrote a developmental history of APLS that was published in 1991 in Law and Human Behavior. So I am borrowing a few things from that article. But here's how it started. It all started with two psychologists. This is how our organization started. September 1968, annual APA convention was held in San Francisco. Two psychologists, one of whom was Jay Ziskin, who is sometimes regarded as the parent of our society, met with a small group of people, less than 15 people, who were interested in psychology and law. And they established a psychology and law society. Within a few months, they already had 77 members. And in June of 1969, less than a year after it was formed, ratification of the first Constitution and bylaws, excuse me, they had trouble coming up with a name for the organization. So they stuck with the name that Jay Ziskin called it, which was the American Psychology Law Society. But a historical footnote for you, the name that actually got the most votes was the Society for Forensic Psychology. So that could have been our name. September 1969, we have our first charter members because we have our Constitution and bylaws. 101 charter members. They came from 28 states. There was one medical doctor, one sociologist, and two lawyers, and the rest were psychologists. By 1971, we're up to 253 members. This is a critical point that I'll come back to. Of these 253 members, more than 40% were attorneys. June 1974, APLS holds its first independent conference. This was held in San Francisco. Any guess on how many people attended the first independent APLS conference? Less than 30. Okay, it was a small group of people who got together. And of course, the APLS conference was held biannually until 2004, until we switched to an annual conference. Then we up 76, we have 350 members. 1977, we see the development of Law and Human Behavior. Bruce Sales negotiated for an APLS-affiliated publication, and that's how Law and Human Behavior came about. So in the late 1970s, after the organization was established, some people were calling for the development of an APA division that would focus on psychology and law. APLS was not an APA division, it was just a society of people. And in 1980, APA established Division 41, which was called Psychology and Law. This was passed by the APA Council of Representatives. In September of 1981, Division 41 had its first business meeting with John Monahan was the first president. He's in the back there. There was some disagreement over whether Division 41 and APLS should merge. Some people were calling for a merge. Don Bursoff, who was president of APLS in 1980 and 81, is famously quoted as saying, "There will never be a Division 41 involving APLS while I'm president." But there was heavy overlap. 70% of people who were members of APLS were also members of Division 41. So it was pretty much inevitable in 1984, 15 years after the founding of APLS, and 3 years after the approval of the creation of Division 41, there was a merger to create APLS Division 41. As a side note, by the way, Bursoff eventually became a staunch supporter of the merger. So let's fast forward 30 years. Here it is, 2017. And what do we have now? We have over 3,200 active members. We've got over 25 committees. LHB is the top-ranked legal journal. It has an impressively high impact factor, incredibly active student committee, and at these annual conferences, we usually get about 1,000 people. So we are firmly established as an organization, and the growth and development of our organization ran parallel to the growth of psychology law as a field. So there's numerous indicators of the growth of the field. I'm not going to go through these in much detail, but forensic mental health assessments, after that watershed case, that federal court case in 1962, we now have tens of thousands of forensic mental health assessments being conducted by psychologists each year. We have the development of more organizations. So in addition to APLS, we have the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law. We have the European Association of Psychology and Law. We see specialization, the American Board of Forensic Psychology, the American Academy of Forensic Psychology. 2001, forensic psychology was recognized as a discrete specialization area by APA. Lots of journals, of course. Some are law journals, some are law psych and hybrid journals. Books. We have some persuasive, some very well-known individual volumes. We have lots of handbooks. We also have the Oxford Best Practice series edited by Tom Grisso, Alan Goldstein, and Kirk Halbrin. We have the APLS book series that Patty Zapf is in charge of that has published over 25 books. Measures have continued to be developed and validated, forensic assessment measures, forensically relevant measures. And then the specialty guidelines for forensic psychology, which were adopted by APA and became APA policy. And then finally, training programs. There are increased offerings for undergraduates to take law and psychology courses. We have multiple master's programs and doctoral programs and some joint degree programs, and we have some postdoctoral programs. So there's no question that we're firmly established as an organization in the field. There's been tremendous growth, but as I said at the outset, we are not immune from challenges. And I believe that our organization and our field is facing important and critical challenges that could define and influence our foreseeable future. So I have 3 goals in life, and these are, and I actually don't believe in goal setting. And sometimes I tell my students this, I don't believe in goal setting. I think that sometimes it's okay, but sometimes you just set up a glass ceiling if you set a goal, right? I think what you should do is strive for excellence. If you strive for excellence, you're probably going to achieve a lot of things. But in terms of life, I have 3 goals, okay? These are the life goals. One is, I want to get through an entire day with no negative thoughts. So it's estimated you have 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day, and I would like 0 of them to be negative. And I have not achieved this, I haven't even come close. But what I do periodically is I set a date, and I say, okay, on that date, I'm going to choose to wake up positive, and I'm going to consciously not have any negative thoughts. I did that last week, and I got out of bed, and the first thing I did, I looked outside and it was raining. I was like, oh, shoot, it's raining. And that was it. I blew it. I would also like to respect people more than they respect me. I can do that sometimes, except when I'm driving. And then finally, and this does dovetail with the profession, I would like to have a completely original idea. I think that we undervalue that. And if you look at the people in this room and in the organization and in the field who have achieved greatness, okay, a lot of times they've done that because they had an original idea. So that's what I'm striving to do. But I haven't done it yet. So continuing in my trend of not having an original idea, for the next part of this talk, I sought input from some of my colleagues. And I have to give thanks to these people in particular. These people spent time talking with me about their ideas and some of the concerns that they have in the field. I've also talked with dozens of other people over the years about what is facing our field and how we might handle it. So these challenges, by the way, that I'm going to identify, based somewhat on input and some, of course, of my own thinking. If you don't agree with these challenges, if you don't think these challenges are valid, if you don't agree with my thinking, then I think we can fairly and squarely blame John Edens. So, who's sitting right back here? Okay. So, yeah. All right. This is, of course, this is not the first attempt to take a status report of where we are as a field and come up with an agenda, which is further evidence I have not had an original idea. But if you look back in the literature, dating all the way back to 1979, Norm Poythress talked about a proposal for training in forensic psychology. Tom Grisso in '87 talked about the economic and scientific future. Bursoff et al. In '97 talked about what was the Villanova conference that focused on training. Randy Otto and Kirk did a status of the field and the future of forensic psychology that was published in American Psychologist. I jumped into the fray a little bit and talked about educational and training models. And then Kirk Halburn and Steph Brooks Holliday did a 10-year agenda for forensic psychology and forensic science. So I'm going to highlight for you what I think are the 5 most pressing challenges facing our organization and our field. Obviously, these are the challenges through my lens. You might not agree with these challenges, and that's great. And if you think there are other challenges, I would like to hear about those as well. I don't want this to come across as too negative. We're a tremendous organization, and I think we're doing wonderful things. These challenges don't mean that we're not a good organization. It just means that we need to get going. We need to face these challenges and find some way to fix it. So again, we are a great organization, but as I tell my students, you should always be content, but you should never be complacent. So we should be content as an organization. We should be able to sit back and say, we've done many great things, but we shouldn't be complacent. We should be looking to get better. All right. So let's go. Challenge 1. How much do we really know, and how do we know it? Many fields of science right now are having a crisis of confidence in terms of what they actually know. So as scientists, we try to uncover truths. That's what we try to do as scientists. But there's accumulating evidence that we know a lot less than we think we know. And this has led to a crisis in confidence in science, and it's illustrated pretty clearly by the replication crisis. This has gotten lots of attention. This is the failure of research to confirm prior research. Why do we care about replication? Because it gives us confidence that what we think we know is something we actually know. That's why replication is important. This is not limited to psychology. Okay? 2012, the journal Nature estimated researchers failed to replicate 47 of 53 landmark cancer studies. You can see in The Lancet in 2004, 85% of biomedical research is not reproducible. But of course, psychology is not immune to this, and the journal Science has talked about it several times. In 2014, 100 global researchers failed to replicate 10 of 27 well-known psych studies. These were landmark psych studies that could not be replicated. Science in 2015, 270 researchers could only replicate 39 of 100 well-known psychology studies. And oh, by the way, in the studies that were replicated, the effect size was on average less than half of what it was in the original study. This suggests, it doesn't indicate, but it suggests that a good deal of published and accepted science is likely false, and that we know a lot less than we think we know. My students and I and some colleagues are doing a project to try to identify what we know in our field to a reasonable degree of certainty. And this is a monster project to put together, and we've been working on it for probably 2 years. Maybe Dan Krause and I have been talking about it for much longer than that. And here's what's shocking about it, or maybe not, but the list is a lot smaller than you think it is when you hold it to that level of a threshold. So why so much? Oh, science estimate in terms of psychology, only 25% of psychology papers are not false positives. So what's going on? Why so much psychology research and science research that doesn't replicate? Outright fraud is probably not the explanation, so I'm not going to focus on that, but I am going to steal a term from John Edens, who talks about sub-fraud concerns. And I think that's a great way to put it. These are the sub-fraud concerns that I've identified. So we have a sample size problem in a lot of social science research. We know that Too small of a sample could lead to a type 2 error and unstable findings. Too big of a sample, just about anything is going to be statistically significant, so you have a risk of a type 1 error. This is a problem in our field. Low statistical power. This increases the likelihood of erroneous results. What I'm calling flexible data collection, which is, and I think I'm being generous there, this is the practice of some people I've heard of who will conduct unplanned interim analyses and stop collecting data when they see statistical significance. Flexible data analyses. I teach statistics at Drexel. Statistics is a science, it's also an art. There are times when your statistics are wrong. I mean, there are times when that's true. More often than not, you can analyze your data in lots of different ways, and you can find what you want to find when you're doing that. P-hacking is data snooping, data dredging. This has gotten some attention recently. This is data mining to look for trends in your data that are statistically significant so you can point them out in the absence of testable hypotheses. This is a problem in our field, and we're seeing this more and more. And small effect sizes. If your sample size is large enough, just about anything could be statistically significant, right? That's the little secret for research. And I tell my students, I guarantee you'll get statistical significance. Just get a sample size of 10,000. The problem is the effect size could be small, and in many of our well-known, established findings in psychology, they're supported by very small effect sizes. So this is a concern. So in short, there's a lot of researcher degrees of freedom. There's a lot of options for researchers to make choices. And again, I don't think these are overt choices to try to come up with some predetermined result, but these are choices that might put them in the best position to be able to find something that might be interesting in what they want to find. This is not surprising because meta-science, which is the study of science itself, has uncovered many threats to how we accumulate knowledge. So we're certainly not immune to this. This raises concerns about how much do we actually know in our field, and it also raises the related question of how do we know when we know it? So I have a modest proposal for moving forward, and I think it starts with better training. Training students on the fundamentals of research design and methodology and statistics. It sounds like, yeah, sure, right, that's where it begins. That's where it always begins. It always begins with training, and I think we need to do, as a field, we need to do a better job. I also think we should put less emphasis on p-values. This has been written about for 15 years. Statistical organizations have called for a moratorium at looking at point significant values. And maybe we should look a little bit more to other indicators of noteworthy findings, things like confidence intervals and effect sizes. Team science is associated with more sound research designs. It's associated with higher powered studies and associated with increased generalizability. Pre-study registration, some journals are now requiring authors to pre-register their study, their hypotheses, their statistical plan. I think we need an increased focus on transparency. This is open science, data sharing, and some journals, again, are moving to this. I think more of our research, and I'll come back to this later, needs to be replication research, needs to be meta-analyses, needs to be systematic reviews. We are at a point, again, to borrow from Tom Grisso's terminology, in our development, we are maturing as an organization and a profession. It's time that we start looking at consolidating our knowledge. Guidelines for reporting findings, I think, would be useful. The generalizability, I went out of order, sorry, the generalizability of scientific findings, particularly for race and ethnicity. This is important, particularly as the composition of the United States is changing to have more minority proportion. I think it's important that we focus on generalizability. And finally, I think we need more self-monitoring. Our work is reviewed. The work we do is reviewed by attorneys, it's reviewed by courts, sometimes it's reviewed by the media. We don't want to find ourselves in the position of some of the hard sciences, the hard forensic sciences, where they are being congressionally mandated to be reviewed by oversight bodies. So I think we need to be the ones to do some self-monitoring at this point. Okay. Challenge 2, field validity and reliability. Some recent research has raised concerns that some of our well-known tests don't function in the real world the same way that they function in research contexts. And this is particularly salient, these concerns, in adversarial contexts. So research by some members who are sitting in this room suggests that some of our widely used and well-validated tests don't function the same in research contexts. And in particular, you might see scores for defense experts that are more favorable to the defense, and scores for prosecution experts that are more favorable to the prosecution. This has been called in the literature adversarial allegiance. Sometimes it's called contextual bias. This, I think, is an outstanding line of research because it has important implications for forensic practice. It exposes threats to validity, reliability, and credibility. Now, there's been lots written over the years of things that affect evaluators, cognitive heuristics and biases and so on. This is such an important line of research because it's empirically showing that we have this adversarial allegiance, and it's been replicated many times. Stay tuned, by the way, for a special issue of Psychological Assessment that's being edited by John Eanes and Mark Baccaccini, where it's going to focus on field reliability and validity. So we have strong empirical evidence that evaluators are swayed by the side that retains them. It's probably not a secret to anyone in here that that can happen. But I think adversarial allegiance runs much deeper in the process of a forensic mental health assessment. I think not only are evaluators' scores on tests influenced by the side that retains them, I think evaluators' forensically relevant opinions and conclusions and recommendations are influenced by the side that retains them. And I don't think it's profound to suggest that, but I think we need to study that. And it's very difficult to study. I'm not suggesting that evaluators are overtly unethical. I'm suggesting that evaluators, like everyone else, are subject to factors that can influence them, some or many of which they might not be aware of. So some people will argue that scientific objectivity is a myth. We shouldn't be striving for scientific objectivity. Or they might argue that the idea of compartmentalizing assumptions is idealistic. There are lots of strategies that have been written about to help evaluators arrive at more objective and valid opinions. Some of those have been studied. But I don't think we know exactly how big of a problem this is. I've talked to a lot of colleagues around the country, including some people who are here in this room, who share concerns about the enterprise of forensic mental health assessment. If you do evaluations and you don't think it's much of a problem, try this exercise, okay? Just use objective data. And as an exercise, try writing a report that favors the defense, and then try writing a report that favors the prosecution. And I think you're going to find that it's a lot easier than you might have thought it was. And that illustrates how the same objective data can be packaged and delivered in ways that might not be objective. So I think we need to examine how big of a problem this is. My colleagues and I are working on a study to do that. We'd like to have collaborators, some of whom I've talked to about this. If replicated science, if we get multiple studies, suggests that forensic evaluators are unduly influenced by the side that retains them, then I think we need to evaluate the enterprise a little bit. We need to figure out a way to handle it. Now, an alarmist might say, well, then we shouldn't have party-retained experts. We should just have court-appointed experts. Someone else might say, well, this is why we have an adversarial context, because reasonable evaluators can reasonably reach different conclusions, and that's why we have an adversarial context. But this is something I think that we need to give some thought to. The third challenge I see in the field relates to training, licensing, and credentialing. And if we look at training, psychology, I'll talk about psychology and law, data suggests we're graduating more people with advanced psych degrees than we have before. In the past 10 years, doctorates have increased 30%, masters have increased 50%. Law is having the opposite problem right now. Law has historically low applications and bar passage rates, and in some geographic areas, employment rates. In 2004, over 100,000 people applied to law schools in the United States. That number has dropped by nearly 50%. So these are some of the concerns I see when it comes to training. Do we have a solid, strong system for training new psycholegal scholars, researchers, and practitioners? We are at a point in our developmental history here for APLS where some of our first generation founding members are retiring. And we need to know that we have a system in place, a strong system, to be able to train subsequent generations of psycholegal scholars. Is employment keeping pace? We're giving lots of degrees to people, lots of master's degrees and lots of doctorates. Is employment keeping pace? It's not in law. That's clear. And it's ambiguous in psychology, depending on the statistics you look at. But I think as to be a responsible profession, we need to analyze whether we are doing a disservice by continuing to award degrees if there's not employment opportunities. In particular, what about people with terminal master's degrees? A master's degree is not the entry-level degree in our field. Your options are limited. And I urge master's programs, terminal master's programs, to evaluate the utility of your program. Are you producing people who are employable based on that education? The next one is something that's sensitive to me, and it's something that I'm very interested in. I'm the director of a joint degree program. But is there convincing evidence that joint degree programs have sufficient utility to justify their existence? This is probably not the best commercial for you to apply to Drexel University's JD PhD program. But as someone asked me recently, hey, if these JD PhD programs are so good and they're such a good idea, why aren't there more of them? You look back 30 years ago, there were 3. Now how many are there? 5? 6? There's not been tremendous growth, at least compared to PhD programs and master's programs. So I think that we need to take a look at the utility of these programs. And then finally, are doctoral training programs adequately preparing people for employment in this current political and economic climate? And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. We also have some concerns with licensing and certification. What does it mean to practice psychology? Jurisdictions, when they award a license to practice psychology does not indicate they have heightened expertise. A license to practice psychology means that the state says that you have the minimal qualifications necessary for independent practice. Okay? But what does the practice of psychology mean? So this is something John Edens and I were talking about. What about people who do trial consulting or jury selection? Is that the practice of psychology? Do you need a license to be able to do that? What about people who do risk assessments in certain contexts? Is that the practice of psychology? Some of these areas are unregulated, and I think we need to take stock of where we are. We also have some credentialing. Now, the American Board of Professional Psychology is widely recognized, but there are an increasing number of these so-called vanity boards. For those of you who are not familiar with that, you pay your money and you get a nice wall certificate to say that you're board certified by this organization. I've encountered this. I know there's people in the room who are ABAPT who may have encountered this. Lots of attorneys and judges and juries don't know what this means. They don't know what it means. And I think that as individual forensic practitioners, we need to do a better job of educating attorneys and courts and juries about what this means. But there's another issue relating to board certification. If data suggests that being board certified is associated with better clinical or forensic practice, then maybe it should be the norm. Maybe we should, as training programs, sort of build that in. And there's certainly postdoctoral programs like UMass and some other ones that do a great job of preparing people for board certification. Board certification is not the norm in our profession, like it is in other professions like medicine, where almost everyone gets board certified. You wouldn't go to a medical doctor who wasn't board certified. In our profession, 3 to 5% get board certified. So I think this is something we need to look at. Challenge 4 relates to dissemination. This is what I'm torn about. I still think it's a challenge. I think that we're doing some dissemination really well. I mean, for me, the purpose of research is to influence practice and policy. That's what I see the purpose of research as being. To change practice and policy, the research needs to be disseminated. And it needs to be disseminated to the people who can change practice and policy. So I think we're doing a good job in some ways. For example, amicus briefs, right? So the Committee on Legal Issues and APA General Counsel have done a really good job of amicus briefs. For those of you who aren't familiar with these are friend of the court briefs. People who are not parties to the action, but who can offer some expertise, can file an amicus brief in a particular case. And I think we do a good job. This is a very direct way of influencing policy. Articles and presentations. Guys, where are we with this? We publish hundreds of articles per year. We do thousands of presentations per year. There are 80 to 100,000 scientific journals in the world. The number of journals is increasing annually by 3.3%. Okay? We are inundated with journals, and a lot of us in this room publish a lot. A lot of us give a lot of presentations. But are the right people reading these articles? Are the right people seeing these presentations? We need to broaden our audience. And again, I don't want to be too critical because there are many people in our organization and field who do a great job of this. But I can say this. One way we can most assuredly not affect wider change is to keep talking to ourselves. And this has some implications that I'll come back to. In fact, I'll talk about it right now. The implication here is I think we need to look at the composition of APLS. So I mentioned again, back in 1971, 40% of the members were attorneys. How many attorneys are sitting in this room? Okay, I see maybe 6, 7 out of, I don't know, 150 people, 200 people. Okay, obviously the percentage has dropped considerably. This is part of my presidential initiative. My presidential initiative has focused on enhancing the L in APLS to try to attract more legal scholars and practitioners and legally trained people to come to our organization. This is going to be a long battle. We need to make our organization more relevant to the law. We need to do that because we are targeting a lot of our research to the law. We want to change policy and the law. And for us to do that, we need to talk to the right people. Challenge 5, this is the last challenge, is responsiveness. If we want to have continued relevance as an organization, and by the way, that's all anyone or anything wants in life, right? You want relevance. You want to feel like you're relevant to someone, right? At the fundamental level, that's what you want in life. If we want relevance as a field and an organization, we need to enhance our responsiveness as an organization. So I talked to some people who do industrial organizational psychology and who work in businesses, and I asked them informally, tell me the characteristics of successful organizations. What makes them successful? And I kind of informally factor analyzed it and came up with what I thought are the two, and it's you got to be able to respond and adapt as an organization. We need to be nimble as an organization. We need to be able to respond quickly if there's a crisis or something where we can offer our expertise. And we need to be able to adapt. So are we responding to the current political climate within APA? So many of you are probably familiar with what's happening in APA. If some people in APA get their way, some of the forensic assessments we do will be drastically curtailed. This is something we need to address head on. Are we responding to the current political climate nationally? I can say with 100% certainty, if there was a number greater than 100%, I would use it, that psychology should not be partisan. I don't think we should be partisan, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be acting. Are we prepared to advocate for social justice? This, I would argue, has increased relevance in our current political climate. This, of course, is consistent with Jen Woolard's presidential initiative. And are we prepared as an organization to do this? Are we willing to expand and embrace new fields? Okay, sometimes I feel like we're a little bit territorial and we don't want to expand. But we've got neurolaw, we've got law and neuroscience. We have these areas that certainly relate to what we do. Are we willing to sort of bring them into the fold as part of our organization? Are we making the best use of technology in terms of assessment, intervention, teaching, and communication? So this is consistent with Patty Zapp's presidential initiative. I think we could enhance our effectiveness as an organization by focusing on communication and dissemination. And finally, are we being active enough in identifying guidelines for best practice in various applied areas? If we as a field identify best practices, then those best practices can become the standard of practice. Standards of practice could then be used by a court or a legislature to establish a standard of care. Standard of practice is the best practices. A standard of care is legally enforceable. If we don't, as a field, establish standards of practice, Someone can establish it for us when they establish a standard of care. We're in the best position to do it, and we're not as active as some other organizations in establishing these guidelines. So, a concluding thought here, we are in a privileged position. We're in privileged positions because of our education, our training, our profession. I believe that psychology is a noble profession. I believe that law is a noble profession. I believe that we have the opportunity to make important contributions to society. Because we're in a privileged position, and to borrow one of my favorite quotes, I believe that as an organization and as individuals, we need to strive to be of use. That's what we need to do. Be of use as individuals, be of use as an organization. I think that way we can strive for excellence. Thank you for your time.